Hello again, and today we have something different. We have a little bit of local history. Canandaigua's Little Giant. Now, we are still following along this little timeline here on the road to the Civil War, and we left off last time with the Missouri Compromise. Now, we're going to be heading into some more compromises, Compromise of 1850, Kansas-Nebraska Act up into here, but pretty much I want to introduce someone today that's going to be playing a big role as we go forward here. And his name is Stephen Douglas, or Steph Douglas, or the Little Giant. Now, he is most known as being a very powerful senator from the state of Illinois. He is called Little Giant because he was quite short and stout, but he was one of the most powerful, famous politicians in the country during the 1850s. Now, don't confuse Stephen Douglas with Frederick Douglass. You can see that Frederick Douglass has two S's in his last name, whereas Steph here only has one. Now, there's another reason why you could confuse them is that they both have a Canandaigua connection. As you remember, Frederick Douglass, who's probably the more influential in the long run and the one who's on the right side of history, he has some some connection to Canandaigua, and that he used to come and speak frequently in Canandaigua while he was living in Rochester. That he is a famous abolitionist, wanted all people to be equal, wanted to abolish slavery. Whereas Stephen here, Steph Douglas, his connection to Canandaigua is stronger, but his place in history might be a little less. So I guess maybe we would be a little less proud of than we would be if we had Frederick to claim as our own. So Steph Douglas, what's his connection to Canandaigua? Well, Stephen Douglas here was born in Vermont. Vermont being mostly wilderness area at that time. He was born in the 1800s, and when he was very, very young, a few months old, I think, at most a year, his father died, leaving his mom to raise him alone. Now, she will eventually remarry, and once they remarry, they are going to move to Canandaigua. Technically, they moved to Clifton Springs, which is near Canandaigua, but they will eventually end up in Canandaigua. And Stephen there, the Little Giant, will end up in Canandaigua as well. So at this time, if you haven't noticed, this part of New York State in the early to mid 1800s was booming between the Erie Canal and all the reform movements. Frederick Douglass up in Rochester. This is really the center of activity in many ways. And a lot of it is because of the Erie Canal. Bringing a lot of traffic through this part of the state, and this part of the state is growing quickly. So Stephen here comes here as a teenager, and this is what Canandaigua would have looked like at this time in the 1830s. And he settles in and attends Canandaigua Academy, which is located on Main Street. It's not the building that is located on Main Street there now. That wasn't built until the old academy on Main Street was built in 1911, I think, in the early 1900s. This building no longer exists, but this is what it would have looked like around the time Stephen Douglas attended it. And there is some controversy about he is listed as a graduate of distinction in Canandaigua Academy. There's some controversy about, I don't think he actually graduated and got a degree from Canandaigua Academy, but he moved on to bigger and better things. So in those days, you could be an apprentice, and Stephen Douglas becomes an apprentice to a lawyer in town just down the street named Walter Hubble. And Walter Hubble, you might think that name rings a bell because we talked about him in one of our earlier videos. He was the lawyer who trained Henry Johnson. Henry Johnson being one of the first African-American lawyers in the United States. And this was a little bit before that time, but this is the same guy, the same law office where Stephen Douglas was trained as a lawyer. So Stephen Douglas trains as a lawyer here, practices law in Canandaigua with Walter Hubble for a few years, or at least in the Hubble Law Office. It might have been with his Walter Hubble's son. Um, he eventually is going to decide to move on to bigger and better things out west. Now, the law office also moved on to bigger and better things. It is still around today. This is the Hubble Law Office, it's called. It is located in the back of Granger Homestead. Now, it didn't used to be located there. It used to be located down on Main Street. However, in the early 1960s, it was going to be torn down. So they dug up the foundation and put it on a truck and moved it to a safe location in the historic Granger Homestead, which a little bit off topic here, but as long as we're talking about the Granger Homestead, this was the home of Gideon Granger. It was built by Gideon Granger, who was the Postmaster General under Presidents Jefferson and Madison, the longest serving Postmaster General in our country's history. And you may be thinking, what's so big a deal about Postmaster General? Well, in those days, the Postmaster General was a little more important than it is today, because if you think about and actually was a part of the cabinet, the Postmaster General had to be the one who figured out how do you deliver mail, which was one of the federal government's main functions. How do you safely and affordably guarantee mail delivery to all parts of the growing country that has very few roads and transportation is slow, etc. But everyone depended on mail. That was the form of communication. So this was a really important job. This guy, as you might guess, Gideon Granger, and his son Francis Granger, who later also served as Postmaster General, they lived here. If you're thinking to yourself, they were in the cabinets of Jefferson and Madison. You are correct, are Democratic Republicans, strong supporters of Democratic Republican, which the Democratic Republican Party will kind of split apart in around the time of Andrew Jackson, because there's some people who are members of that party who are so opposed to Andrew Jackson and think he's an embarrassment that they sort of form this new party that will become the Whig Party. And Francis Granger is one of the people involved in that. So Francis Granger was anti-Andrew Jackson, unlike Stephen Douglas. It's kind of ironic that Stephen Douglas's office ends up there, because Stephen Douglas was a big Andrew Jackson supporter. Now, Stephen Douglas moves west, and this is what the country would have looked at this time. We basically went just beyond the Mississippi River. He moves west to the booming state of Illinois. Now, Illinois was a booming state at that time for a few reasons. One of them was because once the Erie Canal connected the Atlantic Ocean, the Hudson River, Erie Canal, Great Lakes, shipping traffic, Chicago became a major dock area, loading area for ship traffic, bringing goods east and west, and then transporting it down to the Mississippi River. Now, by the time Stephen Douglas moves out there, Illinois is becoming the hub of the new technology, railroads, and railroads to connect things basically from the Great Lakes to the Mississippi River is going to be in early use. So Stephen Douglas moves out there and becomes a lawyer working for railroad companies. And there he meets another young lawyer who moved to town just around the same time as Stephen Douglas, and his name, if you don't recognize him, is Abraham Lincoln, who was a young lawyer as well. They both end up working for railroad companies. They are not necessarily friends, but they're friends of friends. They often attend the same social gatherings, dinner parties, etc. And they actually both date the same woman. Stephen Douglas was courting Mary Todd here, who eventually will marry Abraham Lincoln. So these two, Stephen Douglas and Lincoln, have a long history together. Later on, they will become political rivals as well. Now, Stephen Douglas's main thing that he is known for is going to be his belief in popular sovereignty. Now, he's a Democrat from Illinois. That's what that D, Illinois, means. He served in the House of Representatives, the United States Senate, became one of the most important politicians in the country, considered one of the best public speakers, very powerful person. That's why he was called the Little Giant. He runs for president. He is a strong supporter of popular sovereignty. Slavery is the big issue. He believes that state citizens should vote to settle the slave issue for each individual state. So basically, the people, well, not all the people, the white males of each state should be allowed to vote to decide whether to keep everybody else, or at least African American people, as slaves. So it might sound like voting everything's a good, fair way to settle things. Unless you were a slave, it might not seem so fair that you lose your right because of that. But Stephen Douglas, big believer in popular sovereignty. So things to remember about Steph Douglas here. Stephen Douglas wanted popular sovereignty. As we go on, that's something to remember. Also remember, of course, that he attended Canandaigua Academy and he had that strong Canandaigua connection.